Bible prophecy, the predictions of Christians and the claims of the biblical narrative. I mean, most religions in the world do things like this, but Christians have reinvented and reinterpreted and done everything they can to protect the Bible from being a failed prophecy, because they return to Old Testament texts that say, well, if a prophet predicts and it does not come to pass, stone him to death. Well, guys, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a long time coming that we've done a show on Bible prophecy with Dr. Robert M. Price. You're going to want to check this out. It gets very deep. We go into a lot of different things, and we delve into Bible prophecy fulfillment, the idea of preterism, partial preterism, full preterism, why Christians reinterpret, fringe sects of Christianity that have made claims, and how they have readjusted their claims to try and fit it. And did the early church do the same thing? And I'm not talking early church as in church fathers. The New Testament Christians, could they have also had to readjust their views because of failed prophecy? Stay tuned. You guys don't want to miss this. He also goes into the Old Testament. He suggests ways of defining these things, and we go into a variety of different kinds of prophetic ideas. At the end of the day, this book is something that, in my opinion, needs to be skeptical. You know, when you approach this text, you need to be doubtful and skeptical. I wouldn't pick up any literature, as Doug from Pine Creek has said recently on his episode. I really enjoyed it. Was if you read a book and it had no cover, like, look, this guy runs and jumps off of a cliff and he starts to fly, would that fall in fiction or history? Well, fiction. But as you keep adding elements to it, at what point do you still draw the line and say, no, that's historical. There was a flying man. He really did fly. There was 500 witnesses. This, that. Be a skeptic. And if you're not one and you're watching this as a Bible-believing Christian, check out this content so you can understand why we think the way that we do. I appreciate everybody who's staying tuned and helps supporting this program. Like this, make sure you guys comment your thoughts about the show, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell. I really appreciate it. It helps me a lot, helps this channel grow. All right, guys, thanks. We are Myth Vision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Derek Lambert. I'm feeling a lot better. That influenza type A has passed from me. I think you guys have been praying for me. For some weird reason, I've had a tingling sensation in my spirit, and I knew those demons and devils left when you guys thought of me. I don't know what incantations you guys were saying, but it worked. Today, I brought the master. What's going on, Dr. Price?
Well, I'm working on all kinds of things, so many I can hardly remember them all. The other day I was doing editing chores on an anthology of sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy fiction that's being published by Pulp Hero Press. I was putting together the next issue of the Journal of Higher Criticism. And in fact, I just got my copy today of the current issue, and so we're following it up pretty quick with the next one, in which there will be an over 100-page review of a book which argues that Jesus was a kind of Hindu Essene, and I always love giving attention to opinions and theories that nobody's ever heard of. And I just like the idea of pushing the limits of what's considered probable. Is there anything to so-and-so? And so we got a bunch of good stuff on that one. And I'm doing some reading from, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but let me mention it again if I haven't. I'm doing some reading for a book I've been planning on for a couple of years now called Judaizing Jesus, where I say that I think the view that seems to be universal among New Testament scholars and others, from fundamentalists to liberals, is that whatever else he was, Jesus was a kind of an Orthodox Jew or a Pharisaic Jew. And I argue that this is really a theological concoction to improve Jewish-Christian relations, something I certainly want to see, but not at the cost of making Jesus a ventriloquist dummy. and which is the standard treatment of them, I think. So I found out that somebody else has a book out called Judaizing Jesus, and so I'd be interested in sort of a focus group kind of thing. What do you think of calling the book Circumcising Jesus? Others have warned me, Ed, don't do it. Nobody will take it seriously. But who takes anything I say seriously anyway? What the heck? So that's one thing I'm working on. I'm reading stories to go into Eldritch Tales, which I edit, and just all kinds of stuff. And it's sort of taxing, but just enormously fun. And so I'm doing pretty good, customizing action figures, of course, and it's reading comics, and so I'm having a great time. My daughter Victoria, who moved to the Minneapolis area a few years ago, and then moved to Portland, where you have to step over street people and all that. She's moving back home with us at the end of the month, so I'm really tickled with that, and so everything's going great.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think Circumcising Jesus for a title would be interesting, especially coming from a scholar. And the way you do write with humor, I think it would be good. Judaizing Jesus is more of a serious tone, and it's probably so many books written on that idea that I think coming at it from that angle might be good. What do you guys think? Comment down below. Tell me what you think. I'll let Dr. Price know what you think. Also, ladies and gentlemen, before we even get into this, because I want to talk about prophecy, okay? Failed prophecies, or prophecies that, well, are they really failed? I don't know. You tell me. Before we do that, guys, I want to ask for a favor. I rarely do ask these favors other than you guys like, subscribe, of course, and comment down below. Those are 3 requests I always ask as your host. But I'm going to ask that you guys come together and see if you can contribute either to Dr. Price's PayPal or to mine. Either way, the funds will go to him on getting him a new webcam. I would love to get you guys to help out in any way, shape, or form. If you're interested in helping him get a new webcam, I feel like the quality could step up on these shows, and he can use it to good practice for his own stuff, for like the Bible Geek, or if he ever decides to do future endeavors, he can have a better webcam, because I feel like the demons they're just way too powerful, and none of us are Jesus, and they know who we are. So it's like, they're like, I'm not listening to this guy. This guy's not the strong one, like Jesus is strong enough. So anyways, just being dumb, but please help out. If you guys would, PayPal him on his website and write your reasoning, and the PayPal, gives you a little spot to describe what you're giving him the money for. Or you can give it to me and I can give it to him and tell him, hey, this is going towards a webcam, or I can buy one for him and send it to his house for him. So either way, if you guys are interested in helping, please do so. Now, to prophecy. Dr. Bob, you had some stuff in mind that I think are important. And before we get into those things, I think it's important to recognize a theory that I've been mentioning, and we're going to cover this theory as time goes on, what's called preterism. And for those of you who are watching who aren't aware, preterism is the idea that prophecy has been fulfilled in the past. So it's a teaching that says something has been fulfilled. So technically, even if I'm a non-believer and I don't believe prophecy, I still could suggest they retrospectively apply certain things to the context of something and say, fulfilled. Like Jesus says that the temple will be destroyed. Well, this would be an argument, and one of many arguments, on why the Gospels were written after the temple's destruction, but yet attributed as if they were written prior, suggesting Jesus is saying it's going to happen. Prophecy. Christians call that prophecy. We in the scholarly field would say, hey, this is a red flag that this text may have been written after. Probability starts to go up that this was written after the fact, the fact, based on some evidences that we look at. Now, preterism says that is a past fulfillment. Everyone that's a Bible believer, has some sense of preterism in their ideology. So some say some prophecies have been fulfilled, but there's still future ones yet to come, partial preterist. And then full preterists say every Bible prophecy that's ever been claimed from the resurrection, the apocalypse, you name it, that has been fulfilled. I just want to throw that out there before we even get into this long adventure that Dr. Bob's going to take us on, because I was a full preterist and I thought it had to happen. So it did happen because Jesus' words stand true. So Dr. Bob, I'm going to be silent and it's going to be picturing you now, and I'm going on mute, and I might interject if you allow me, sir, but I will just be here as a student.
Yeah, please do chime in at any point. There are a bunch of subtopics in this. I'd like to point out that though this is a huge topic in itself, the idea of messianic prophecies, I don't think they're, well, subdivide that one. I think that not only is Jesus not predicted in the Old Testament, but there are no messianic predictions in the Old Testament of any Messiah. There are a couple of steps taken toward it, like when Ezekiel says that God will send David. Does he mean a second coming of David? Well, we never really hear that otherwise, but it's not impossible. There were people that thought that Moses would come back and that Elijah would. But is that a Messiah? Well, given who David was, it could well be, but that's really very ambiguous. We don't know what the writer had in mind. And most of the other things that are said to be messianic prophecies, even if you don't think they're predicting Jesus, like a couple of passages in Isaiah, I think one in chapter 9, one in chapter 11, he shall be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father, etc. The government will rest upon his shoulders. This kind of stuff turns out, once you look at form criticism, like is there a particular literary type in a passage, that reveals that what you're reading there are enthronement oracles of each new king of Judah and perhaps Israel, or their birth oracles, which kind of amount to the same thing, and it's hard to distinguish them because in Psalm 2, which is another one, I will tell of the decree of Yahweh. He has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Well, we know from Egyptian parallels and others that this was the kind of official rhetoric of the enthronement of a new king. As of his enthronement, he counts as the Son of God. And at the end it says, kiss the Son, or bow down to the Son, or whatever, lest he strike you in his wrath and all that. That has to do with the king. Now, scholars still debate, and they're right to debate, whether this meant that the king of Judah, as soon as the old one died and the new one took the throne, that he was given divine nature, or just given divine stature, as like the Pope is not supposed to be Christ, but he's the vicar of Christ on earth. Well, it may have been the same way when they called the king of Judah mighty God, and so forth. They may simply have meant you're the placeholder for God. You're his representative on earth, and you have the mandate of heaven, as they would say in China. And so these passages sound like or it says that the lion will lie down with the lamb in his day, and peace will prevail, and the spirit of the Lord is upon me to release the prisoners and liberate the oppressed. That these were all repeated liturgies, kind of like the swearing in ceremony of a new president. They weren't predicting anybody. They were just giving the exaggerated hopes for the reign of the new king. And then there were other parts of the royal rituals of enthronement including the humiliation of the king and then his re-exaltation, which is based on the royal ideology of the divine combat. I've talked about this a bunch of times, that is, as God's representative on earth, the king would undergo a dramatized version of the combat myth whereby Yahweh, like Marduk and various other Near Eastern deities, they became the king of the gods by volunteering to defeat and destroy the chaos dragons, though in the process they were devoured and killed, but rose from the dead, or at least carved their way out of Leviathan or whatever dragon was involved. And so that they had a kind of a dramatization where you'd have a bunch of guys in a dragon suit, like in a Chinese New Year festival, and you'd have the king, and he'd make a show of maybe with a wooden sword defeating the dragon, and all the guys would lie down, and then he'd go up the steps to the palace, and the high priest would knock the crown off his head and tweak his ears and so on. But why? Well, because this also had to do with the regeneration of vegetation for the new year. The energy of the earth had run out, and this was because of the sins of the people. And so the king was the bearer of these sins, and this was the humiliation, was the token punishment for the sins. But once that happened, his crown was put back, and he would go into the temple and supposedly get a vision of the tablets of destiny. In one of the Psalms, it says, "My days were written in the book before I even existed." Well, yeah, they figured all of history was written ahead of time. Something that I think Calvinists would like, because it was a sort of predestination. Well, so Isaiah 53 and possibly Psalm 22, which are always quoted as predictions of the sufferings of the Messiah, or just as often of Jesus as the Messiah. These things do have to do with the ancient sacred king business, but they're not predicting anybody. They're not in the future tense. It would be very easy to say. There are predictions in the Old Testament, but as far as I can see, there are not messianic predictions. Like Isaiah 53, we thought he was the sinner. Everything was on his shoulders, but no, it was our transgressions. That fits the attested ideology of the king being the suffering servant, and so on. It's Christians say, come on, how can you deny that Isaiah 53 matches Jesus? Well, yes, it does, but not for the reason you think. They're drawing on this ancient tradition and applying it to Jesus. It's a different sort of a thing. If you know Jesus is the Messiah, then you start thinking about applying some of these old he's the king, right? The king of Israel. You start applying these things to him. It wasn't stupid. It wasn't a hoax. It's just that, understandably, most Bible readers are not in the position to know what was probably the point of these passages. And when you find out, it all looks totally different. So it's not a question of failed prophecies. They weren't prophecies. There are passages that supposedly predict Jesus that are just yanked out of context, like Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Well, does that mean that, just a second, I'm getting a call from the Holy Spirit here.
I kind of thought it sounded like the Holy Spirit, same noise it makes when it's calling me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
It wasn't, they say, okay, Jesus and his family must have gone to Egypt and come back for some reason, and the stories grow. They apply the Moses nativity with Pharaoh trying to kill all the kids. Oh, well, yeah, that must be what it's predicting, but it was about Jesus. Well, was it? Of course not, on the literal sense of it. Any idiot can see that in Hosea it's talking about the Exodus, that Israel was God's son and so forth. And there are other ones like that. Zechariah, where he says, I got a job as a shepherd to dramatize a point, and they fired me and just gave me a severance pay, basically, of the 30 shekels of silver. And this is how they've dismissed God. And so it's a kind of an acted parable. Okay, but does that really predict, as Matthew thought, that Jesus was sold for a bounty of 30 pieces of silver? Nobody else even says that, and he quotes Zechariah. Well, that's a whole different thing. In cases like that, and this would have sounded like opportunistic, out of context quotes from the Bible, like the old joke, I hope it's only a joke, where somebody says, hey, the Bible teaches atheism. What? Where does it say that? Right here in the Psalm, it says, there is no God. Well, take a closer look. It says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. I mean, that's, as I say, a joke, I hope. I hope nobody does that. But it was easy to think, and some critics charged that they knew you didn't have your own copy of a Bible to look at, and you'd just be suckered. But the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls made it clear that no, something else is going on. Just like the guys at Qumran, they quote things out of Habakkuk, especially, that they say predicted the coming of their founder, the teacher of righteousness. Well, it becomes pretty clear that they didn't think it was a literal one-for-one prediction, like Gene Dixon predicting JFK's assassination, supposedly. No, their idea seems to have been that this is the word of God. It's living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, like Hebrews says. It can't be relegated to a museum relic. It's like the pilgrims said, there must be new light to break forth from the sacred text. After all, it's inspired by God. And so they said, okay, we know what it meant once, but the spirit of truth had concealed in it a second level of prophecy that could not be recognized until it had been fulfilled. So those were only predictions in the sense of providing a kind of a thematic proof text. They didn't think anybody before the coming of the teacher of righteousness could ever have been expected to think that that's what it was about, and they knew what it was about. But and so you look at Matthew when it quotes Isaiah 7:14, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and all that stuff. Matthew he wasn't trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Oh yeah, Isaiah was talking about Jesus. No, he wasn't, and Matthew didn't think so. The point was that there must have been a hidden prediction, kind of like the Bible code furor from some years ago. And that's impossible to refute, but you see, there are two problems with it. It's not a predictive prophecy, since you can't know in advance what it ostensibly means on this deeper level. And second, it's totally uncontrollable. That is, you can make it apply to anything. And there are some apologists who are sophisticated enough to realize, well, yeah, Isaiah 7:14 explicitly refers to something to happen in the writer's own day, before this kid is old enough, etc. And so they'll say, and like Arthur Pink, a great Reformed prophecy scholar, and various others say, oh yeah, it did have a primary historical reference, but it also had a double fulfillment. And they'll say that about the revived Roman Empire, etc. Yeah, we know they were talking about the Roman Empire with Caesar and all that. But Uh, there's a secondary meaning. The stage will be set again, and you'll have something like the common market, which will finish the prophecy. Well, I don't know how Protestants can say that in good conscience, because as Martin Luther pointed out, you start interpreting the Bible that way, you can make the Bible mean anything, and that's what happens. The Bible simply becomes a ventriloquist dummy. Well, you may not think the Bible talks about selling indulgences, but right here, interpreted the way the bishops say, get out of here. You can make it say anything in that case. So it's not an apologetic, really. You can talk that way if you want, but if you want to believe in secondary interpretations and all that, but you're winging it. I mean, that's just speculation, and I don't condemn that, but you got to recognize that's what you're dealing with. You cannot say, you Jews, why don't you see that Jesus was the Messiah? Like, I think Hal Lindsey says, in the crucifixion alone, there were 300 prophecies literally fulfilled. What are you talking about? It's just ridiculous. If you want to say, now this is just theology, I think that that these same themes, it was like typology. They were hints that something analogous is going to happen, but that's not worth anything for apologetic purposes. Nobody could have guessed that there was any such reference before the fact. Now, this is kind of similar to what you said with another element, the so-called vaticinium ex eventu, where there, in a book, whether in the Bible or not, it does predict something in pretty clear terms, like the destruction of Jerusalem, but it kind of looks like this was written afterward to make it look like it had been predicted. James Barr, in his great book, Fundamentalism, uh, says that scholars will hold out for this being a genuine prophecy. Oh, you critics, you just don't believe in divine foreknowledge and predictive prophecy. If you allowed for that, you'd agree with us. No, Barr says the same criterion is used by all scholars when it comes to non-canonical books like Fourth Ezra, Second Baruch, and a number of other ones, where it's just obvious enough that they've placed the time of writing in an earlier era. Like Second Esdras has to do with the fall of Jerusalem to Rome, but it's portrayed as if it's Ezra commenting on the Babylonian destruction of the temple, and it's sort of thinly veiled, and everybody recognizes many characteristics of this, and to suddenly say, oh, but it's different in the Gospels. Why? Well, it's obvious. They think that's deceptive. It sort of is, but you have to have more sympathy for it once you recognize it as a literary genre. It's an affirmation of faith in the providence of God. He could have had somebody predict it. It was written in his book. And so don't worry. If you're in a time of persecution, you can have faith in God, and it'll be faith. It's not proof. I mean, you can take that pseudepigraphy and stuff in a more benign way, but it is not a literal prophecy, and it doesn't seem like it anyway. So it seems to me there are no messianic prophecies. There are no predictions of Jesus. It's pure arbitrary speculation to say, well, okay, it wasn't literally about it, but in some figurative way it is. That's just guesswork, and it's passed off as doctrine, which is irresponsible. Again, if you want to say the Holy Spirit is leading us to see this here, go ahead. That's a different thing. That's like a prophecy of your own, and if that's what you believe, it's not absurd. Go ahead, but it's not apologetics fodder. In fact, it just discredits it. There's a great book by my Jesus Seminar pal, Robert J. Miller called Helping Jesus Fulfill Prophecy. An excellent, very recent book where he goes through all the supposed predictions of Jesus and shows how they're about other things and so forth, and what the ancients thought prophecy was, and so on. So any traditional appeal to prophecy is problematical. Now, were there predictions of events, victories and defeats? It looks like there were, but were they always fulfilled? It doesn't seem like it was, and I want to come back to this in a minute with reference to preterism. Um, Preterism has two references, well, more than two, as you just said, this partial and full preterism, but historically, preterism referred to a way of interpreting the book of Revelation that said that the predictions were made long ago about events believed to be happening in the near immediate future. That the Antichrist was probably supposed to be Domitian, who was understood as a kind of a revived Nero, and that he would gain revenge on Rome by destroying it, by marching in at the head of the Parthian Empire's troops, and that the locusts in the book of Revelation are described in an odd way, suggesting that they're really talking about Parthian cavalry. They're centaurs. Well, it's the horse-mounted cavalry. They have the long hair like the hair of women. Well, that was the horsehair crests on the Parthian helmets. The clashing of the locusts' wings was like the clashing of armor, because that's what it's supposed to be. And preterists like R.H. Charles, for instance, said that all of these things were predicting the imminent fall of Rome and the coming of Christ in the sky to defeat the persecutors and all of that. And of course, it didn't happen, but that's what it meant. Well, now, of course, devout Christians couldn't stomach that. They said, well, that would make the book of Revelation a false prophecy. Well, a lot of people in the ancient church thought it was. But others said, and this was at least as old as the Reformation, they took the historicist alternative. That was a way of interpreting Revelation as a series of sort of parabolic prescriptions of the rest of church history up until their day. And that's kind of what's going on in the beginning, the first three chapters with the letters to the seven churches. But even there, it's not really a close match, but they started with that and said each of the churches is an era of the capital C church, and the rest of it is too, so that the beast is the papacy, not even any particular pope, but the whole establishment, and the false prophet is Muhammad and Islam. And it's all leading up to our day. That's why Luther called the Pope the Antichrist. It wasn't just mudslinging. This was what he thought the Bible was saying prophetically about our day. Well, that seems kind of arbitrary, and it seems to have sort of gone off the track if that's what was intended. But today, what preterism has come to mean is it's sort of based on Russell's view. I forget his.
Yeah, James Stewart Russell.
Yeah, that's it. In a book called The Parousia of Our Lord, etc. A great book. The guy was what we would call a fundamentalist in the sense of a literalist. And because he wouldn't put up with the nonsense that when Jesus said, behold, I'm coming soon, and this generation will not pass away, the nonsense that he didn't really mean that. He meant it'll be soon, but of course, I mean in God's timetable, not yours, but I'm not telling you that. What the heck? And that's just as stupid as the creationist idea that says that it was 7 days, but not our days. Let's get some geology.
Yeah.
Russell would have none of that. He said it doesn't mean suddenly, it means soon. And he goes into the Greek and all that stuff. So what does he do? Does he say that, well, it's all over and it dropped off the edge of the world, so to speak? No, he did think, look, Jesus said this stuff. We have to assume as believers that it was fulfilled, but maybe not exactly the way you think, with emphasis on the modifier there. It's obvious, and of course he's right about this, and preterists are following in his footsteps, sort of, are right when they say that, look, isn't it clear that Mark 13, Luke 21, Matthew 24, that they're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple? I mean, that's how it begins. You see these great buildings, look at them while you can, because they've got to be leveled to the ground before this generation is out. Of course it's about the destruction of Jerusalem. They're right about that. But then it says immediately after those days, they'll see the sign of the Son of Man in the sky, and the Jerusalem circled by armies, and its destruction is nigh, and he'll gather the elect and all of that. What about that? Russell said, who's to say it didn't happen? There weren't a whole lot of Christians around at the time. Maybe the fledgling religion, all of its members did get raptured, especially if it happened at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. It was total chaos. They say, I haven't seen Menachem around lately. Maybe he was raptured, like in The Life of Brian. Where did he go? He's been taken. Oh, no, there he is. And Russell makes a good point. And he said that would explain the mediocre to crummy quality of the second generation of Christians. They seemed to have been superstitious. They knew nothing about the Pauline doctrine of grace. Why? Well, if all the apostles were raptured at the time, they had to kind of reinvent the thing and did a lousy job. Again, that's not stupid if you believe in it, the possibility of a rapture. And though I would add that the New Testament does depict a literal resurrection of the dead in the time of Jesus, though it's too early to fit this prophecy. It's the Matthean Night of the Living Dead thing, with the righteous dead come out of their graves and all that. And in Revelation, it says that the two witnesses are killed and then raised in the sight of everybody. Well, he thinks that, I think he has some trouble with the business quoting Zechariah, every eye shall see him. But then on the other hand, in the Gospel of John, it seems to negate that. And one of the disciples at the Last Supper says, Lord, what has happened that you're going to reveal yourself to us, as you've just said, but not to the whole world? Well, John has in mind, every eye will see him. And that, I think, is the direction to follow, because the parousia, the second coming, didn't happen. They spiritualized it away, and the result was realized eschatology. That is what happened with the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, and various others, right? They say, he's coming tonight. In a couple of weeks, he'll be back. So you better repent. And then it fell through very publicly, and they said, he did come, but we had it slightly wrong. He's orbiting the earth, and he's ruling the nations invisibly from heaven. Well, wasn't he before? The Adventists, we thought he was going to come and purify the temple, and that meant he was going to judge the wicked on earth, but I guess not. It must be that he somehow purified ceremonially the heavenly tabernacle that Hebrews describes. We just had it wrong, but that's what it meant. But that's a classic thing. Or the sect that Festinger and the other guys in that book, when prophecy failed. They said that the aliens are going to come and destroy the earth unless you're a believer like us, in which case you'll be raptured up to the flying saucers and so on. I don't want to make these people sound crazy. It is a crazy sort of a notion, but that just means it's not normal. It's a minority view, and it seems plausible because it's reinforced by your fellow sectarians. That's the way psychology works. It doesn't mean they're insane, the ancient ones or the modern ones, but that's kind of how it happens. Well, it seems pretty clear that the Gospel of John said, okay, that failed. We're going with realized eschatology. Jesus and the Father are in our hearts and represented by the Paraclete and so forth. Well, Russell mentions that statement, but as I remember, he seems to just juxtapose that with every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, etc., saying, well, that's not the whole story, make of it what you will. So what does he think happened? Well, he thought really it was, though it could have been just not noticed. And again, that doesn't sound that stupid, thinking of the Jerusalem scenario. He said, however, that he thought that that it was the harrowing of hell, which we really don't read about in the New Testament, though a couple of passages are interpreted that way out of context, not unreasonably, but they're just fragmentary. Like when he ascended on high, he brought a host of captives with him in Ephesians somewhere, and they say, well, what captives? Maybe it was the Old Testament heroes who were confined to Sheol, just waiting and waiting for Christ to come and die to ransom or redeem them. I mean, that's got to mean something. He's freeing people from some kind of captivity, and that's what it was. We read about the full-blown thing in the Gospel of Nicodemus, a 4th century work. But that doesn't mean they invented it for it. Or in 1 Peter, he was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he also went to preach to the spirits in prison who were disobedient in the days of Noah. Well, I think that that's a misinterpretation. That I think it was Rendell Harris who said, no, you're splitting up the non-stop lines of the text. It didn't say in which also, en ho ke in Greek. It meant the spirit in which Enoch preached to the spirits in prison, which he does in the book of Enoch, right? So that's not even, though he wouldn't have known that, Russell wouldn't have, but he figured that kind of thing was implied, at least in Ephesians. And that's interesting, and it would mean that there wouldn't be a future resurrection. Now, how you can square that with 2 Thessalonians, that the trumpet blast, the voice of the archangel, we who are alive, first the dead in Christ will rise, and then we who are alive and remain will join him in the air, where we will live with him forever. I don't know how you can square that with saying it was only the harrowing of hell business, which would have been past in the author's time. So I don't quite buy that. But what today's preterists have done is to take that basic idea and they've come up with a kind of realized eschatology, which means that there is no basis for any, as far as I can see, any future eschatology, that there is not going to be any second coming of Christ except in some vague, realized eschatological way. By the way, the Baha'is did this too, that Mirza Hussein Ali, the Bab, the gate to God, he said that he was the hidden imam of Shiite Islam, and everybody thought it was all going to come down with the Mahdi and all of that. And then he was killed, martyred, and one of his disciples No, I'm sorry. The Bob was Ali Muhammad. One of his disciples, Hussein Ali, he appeared and said, well, you thought it was going to be thousands of years in the future, but I am the predicted successor. And what you need to know is that all the prophecies of the imams and so on were meant metaphorically. That's why Jesus got into such trouble. Those were meant metaphorically too, and so forth, which is kind of an attractive view. But either preterists should just go with a kind of liberal realized eschatology, which kind of amounts to post-millennialism in a way, that this is as much of a millennium as you're going to get. Let's try to make it worthy of that. Yeah, that's a noble view. That was like the social gospel eschatology of the old turn of the century liberals. So you could do that, and there are groups like the Quiverful movement, like the that group. What the heck were they on TV for a long time? Oh geez, I think it started with a G. I can't remember. They had like 20 kids, and they intermarried
Oh,
with
yeah. Aren't they? Are you talking about like a Mormon type group? Or are you talking about like a Baptist type of? Or is
well,
this
they
totally
weren't
different?
Mormons. I think they were like standard Protestant fundamentalists,
Yeah.
except that they were like post-millennialists or realized eschatology. I had the great treat of talking to a woman who had been in one of these groups, and I said,
Interesting.
are you, as the Quiverful movement, do they expect a literal second coming, or is their quest to populate the world eventually with a Christian majority by having zillions of kids? Is that the second coming? She says, yeah, that's what they think. And also some of these disgusting, loathsome Christian identity bigots, I hope I haven't spoken too nastily of them, they believe that that there's not going to be any literal second coming, and that they have to militarily take over. In fact, I've thought of writing a novel about that, where it turns out they're right, and the half right, half wrong, because Christ appears as a radical militia leader, so I don't know, maybe one day, who knows? But
Well, I know that in light of these theories, and going into, there's the realized eschatology. They call it covenant eschatology. A lot of them now call it covenant eschatology. There's an idea of full preterism that we're going to talk about further down the road as we can get some literature written on this whole Israel only business. Also, they believe all the prophecies happened, okay, and that the end happened, and the context for the people, the elect, the remnant, the chosen, the 144,000, et cetera, they utilize a lot of harmonization, make sense of this. They're all according to the narrative, even if they don't believe the Bible, because some of them are agnostic and atheist, and they're trying to give an interpretive methodology to make sense of what the story's saying. They'll say the rapture happened, Israelites that were the chosen, the elect, were taken, and everything ended. The gospel had been preached. The mission is accomplished. Christ has fulfilled the whole daggone thing. And everyone after the first century that took this book as their own are mistaken. And everybody created, like you said, this religious system, because like you said, everyone's gone. There's no real movement anymore. So here, what do we do with these books? This book says salvation is of the Lord. Let's apply this to ourselves. And this is where all these ridiculous different concepts and ideas come from. And that's another theory, that it's all over with. And they combat every day in these rooms on Facebook. I witness this like every day. It's fun. I just love watching them go forward. They're combating the covenant eschatology realist people, the covenant or the realized eschatology guys. And these guys are like, stop trying to put yourself into the narrative. And the covenant eschatology or realized eschatology guys are like, you guys are wrong. And, Christ was predicting a new covenant that was everlasting. And so they just go back and forth all the time. And so that's just another one that has developed since James Stewart Russell's
Mm,
come on the scene. Since
mm.
James Stewart Russell's, there's so many offshoots of versions of that type of preterism
Oh.
that people have they've logically taken that system and they've ran with what they think are the most logical explanations of these positions. And one of them is the Israel only full preterism, which we'll get into at some point down the future.
Well, there are puzzle pieces that point at least in that direction. The fact that even in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, for instance, we're told of a faction of the Jerusalem church that said, you don't need to go out to the Gentiles. This is for Jews. I think the big question, like the great German New Testament scholar Joachim Jeremias did a short book called Jesus' Promise to the Nations, where he said he thought that Jesus didn't foresee a Gentile mission. But what he did hold was, and this is sort of, it's ingenious, but it's pretty iffy. He must have thought what Isaiah and Micah both say in virtually the same text, so somebody's borrowed it from the other, where it says that in the last days, the nations will stream into Mount Zion to learn the Torah. Now, why would they do that? Well, because the promises of God have been fulfilled, the enemies of Israel have been dispatched, and it's now pretty obvious who was right. And so they want to learn. Okay, you were right. Tell us about it. And so that Jeremias thought that Jesus must have thought that, like Calvinism in the 19th century. You don't need to go and preach to those people. God will take care of it in his own time. So it's kind of like that. I think in the Mark 13 Apocalypse, when it says that God will gather together the elect from ends of the earth, that's not the rapture. That's the well-known Jewish belief that that diaspora Jews would return to the Holy Land. But I think you can't really recruit Paul for that, or the author of Acts. But that something like that may have been one of the early Christian views, though nobody ever says that all of the Christian Jews vanished. I think Russell said that there's a hint of that in the patristic writings that, well, Eusebius, for instance, at least Eusebius, who said that during the Roman siege, or right before it, the Jerusalem church got word via prophecy that they ought to get the heck out, and that's reflected in Mark. When you see the Russians, the Romans coming up, the head for the hills, don't go back for anything in your house. He didn't plug Mark 13 into that, but he's thinking of Eusebius, who says that the Jerusalem church did get out to avoid the impending siege, and they went to Pella. And there's a big debate over whether that was true or not, and so on. But Russell says he thinks that was a kind of a patristic misunderstanding of the sudden absence of the Jerusalem Christians who had been raptured without anybody noticing. And again, that's not ridiculous if you believe in a rapture. You wouldn't necessarily have everybody see it. They'd say, hey, where's so-and-so, and who knows. I'd like to read a couple of pages out of my book, The Paperback Apocalypse.
Please do, yes.
As my old pastor Don Morris once said in a sermon, I'm going to quote myself so as not to misrepresent my own thoughts. Let's see here. What if the eschatological predictions of the New Testament all had reference to contemporary events and were fulfilled? What if they all referred to the fall of Jerusalem, and with it the end of the sacrificial system and the dawn of a new covenant through Jesus Christ? I quote Russell, sometimes the old or Jewish economy or dispensation is spoken of as this eon, the present eon, and the Christian or gospel dispensation as the coming eon and the world to come. And he gives Ephesians 1:21, Hebrews 2:5 as citations. And continuing with Russell, the close of the Jewish economy is called the end of the age. Since then, the old economy was finally set aside and abrogated at the destruction of Jerusalem, we conclude that the new aeon received its solemn and public inauguration at the same period, which coincides with the parousia, the coming present. End of quote. Now me again. Suppose all the imagery of cosmic catastrophe, stars colliding with the earth, the sun going out, the sky snapping up like a window shade, was simply a collection of well-established metaphors drawn from Old Testament prophets who had described previous historical events in similar world-shaking hyperbole. Well, it would mean that pesky critical scholars would not be able to say that Jesus and the New Testament writers were mistaken. It would save face, but the price would be high. There would be no more Christian eschatology, no reason to believe in a yet future second coming of Christ. One would have at one blow exorcised apocalyptic from the New Testament like a foul-smelling demon. And that would not necessarily be bad. Christian theology could return itself to the earlier view of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, innocent of the determinisms and dispensational timetables of Zoroastrianism. That's probably where they got the idea. It would mean an open-ended model of a history that could end, if at all, with a whimper or a bang, or with the millennium as we so decide. Perhaps not a bad trade at all. But what of the return of Jesus, the resurrection of the dead, the translation of the living believers? One expects Russell at this point to start demythologizing and allegorizing, retreating into some kind of realized eschatology, but he does not. He does the next best thing, suggesting that all these things did happen in connection with the fall of Jerusalem. They occurred literally and in 70 AD. Russell says that not having been present, we cannot know whether the events were visible to the eye of flesh. It would have been a secret rapture in the most literal sense possible. But did not Christians appeal to Zechariah 12:10, every eye shall see him, every one who pierced him? This thing would not be done in a corner, or would it? John implies such a change in plans, a restriction of the second coming to a private event. Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? John 14:22. Just as Elijah's return was seen by a small few, that is on the Mount of Transfiguration. Oh, he came all right, but only a few people saw him. As for a contemporary resurrection of the dead, remember, Matthew portrays just such a thing in Matthew 27:51 through 53, as does Revelation 11:11 through 13, where the two martyrs, compared to Moses and Elijah, but whom Russell identifies as Simon Peter and James the Just, are actually resurrected and elevated to heaven publicly, though by themselves. Russell notes that such an event may have escaped human physical eyes in the very nature of things. But the heart of the end time resurrection for Russell is the harrowing of hell, the descent of Jesus to Hades to liberate the worthies of the Old Testament, barred from heaven until Jesus paid the price of admission by his precious blood. Who saw this? Only angels, but it would seem to be enough to answer to Christian hopes of the resurrection. But the rapture of the living? Could that have happened? Darn right, says Russell. Their vanishment was lost amid the general confusion of the destruction of Jerusalem. For Russell, it is implied the patristic account of the Jerusalem church fleeing the doomed city to take refuge in Pella is a mundane, after-the-fact explanation by those who knew that a whole generation of Christians, Christ's contemporaries, was simply all gone. This would handily explain the dearth of information we possess about the immediate so-called post-apostolic generation. They were caught up from the earth. This is great. In this manner, Russell even seeks to explain why Mark ended so abruptly at 16:8, why Luke ended Acts before relating the death of Paul. They were raptured before they could finish. By the way, Martin Luther worked feverishly on his translation of the Bible into German, hoping he had time to finish it before the second coming. Anyway.
Wow.
Christianity had to start again, and that in turn might explain why the quality seems to have dropped so precipitously, as all church historians, not to say Latter-day sect founders, believe it did. One thing, one thing is sure, Russell was the man Diogenes was looking for. His long, packed text contains a number of statements bracing in their honesty. He has no patience for the kind of exegetical evasions we have criticized. Russell says, this is not the stuff this generation really means this race and all. Says this is not criticism, but mysticism. So artificial and intricate an explanation could never have occurred to the disciples, and it is surprising that it should have occurred to any sober interpreter of Scripture. Language is incapable of conveying thought with accuracy if these words do not affirm that the return of our Savior to his disciples was to be speedy. And the apologetics thing, he says, this is a non-natural method of interpretation which simply evacuates words of all meaning. So I just love hearing somebody that honest. And as extravagant as his thesis seems, he has to resort quite seldom to the sort of text twisting he condemns in others. For instance, desirous of avoiding the implication of references to the end of the world, because he wants to restrict the eschaton to Jerusalem and its environs, Russell adopts the old Calvinist dodge embraced on behalf of the post-Calvin limited atonement doctrine that denies Christ died for everybody, whereby the world can mean something other than the whole world population. We feel a bit less uncomfortable when he contends that all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, Matthew 24:30, means only the tribes of the land, that is, of Palestine. And yet if
You're getting into some good stuff there. Yeah, this is getting good.
Yet even these embarrassments might have been obviated had Russell been able to avail himself of the higher criticism. In a later era, he might have adopted the solution of John A.T. Robinson and H.B. Sharman, who thought the Synoptic Apocalypse originally did mean to predict only the fall of Jerusalem, with no worldwide history extinguishing repercussions, but that such wider horizons were added to the text later, albeit already before Mark. So Mark does have it extended to the world, but he's already inherited a reinterpretation of it. Okay, frankly, it is amazing that Russell, taking it all at face value as transcripts of the words of Jesus, is able to make as persuasive a case as he does. But I think the preterist case contains a fatal flaw. How do preterists know that the rhetoric of cosmic catastrophe is mere metaphor for events that will rock your world? Simply because they are able to catalog plenty of examples of such imagery embellishing ancient predictions of historical events, including the defeat of Babylon. Isaiah spoke of the stars falling, of the sky rolling up, and so on, when in fact all that happened was the defeat of Babylon, Isaiah 13, 9 through 10 and 13, or of Basra in Isaiah 34, 5 through 6. Micah had the mountains melting like wax at the coming of God to judge Samaria, Micah 1, 3 through 4. And if such language need not imply literal cosmic catastrophe in such cases, why take it literally in the New Testament apocalypses? But this is completely circular. What preterists are doing in the case of Old Testament prophecy is drawing the same inference Russell did concerning the New Testament ones. From the evident fact that no such cosmic pyrotechnics occurred, they infer that none were ever supposed to. It was just figurative. And so on. Robert P. Carroll, dealing with Old Testament prophecy, sums it up well. Quote, "The need to treat the language as symbolic only arises because of the failure of the predictions in the first place." End quote. It seems that what we are dealing with in the Old Testament is a series of delays and disappointed or only partially fulfilled promises. Perhaps Antiochus Epiphanes did perish, but the kingdom of God did not come. Maybe the empire of Babylon did fall, but the sky did not fall. Maybe the Persian Empire did become unstable, but that didn't issue in Zerubbabel becoming the new Messiah. The chest-thumping assurances of apologists like Tim LaHaye that the Old Testament prophecy had proved 100% accurate are just empty utterances of those who have not read their Bible closely enough. There are many signs of frequent, nearly done, of frequent predictive failure throughout the Old Testament. The famous Deuteronomic command to stone prophets whose prognostications fail is itself ample proof of frequent prophetic failure, isn't it? Or think of the prophetic declarations that inform their audiences that there will be little delay before so-and-so happens. Quote, "Once again, in a little while, I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, so that the treasures of all nations shall come in, and I will fill this house," the temple, "with splendor," says Yahweh Sabaoth, Haggai 2:6. We usually overlook the peculiar note of deferral, "in a little while." The prophet Habakkuk is disarmingly blunt when he says, quote, "For still the vision awaits its time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. Should it seem slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay." 2:3. The key phrase is "for yet a very little while," or "for there is still a very brief period." Similar phrases occur elsewhere in Isaiah. Carroll explains what is going on in such passages. Quote, "The not yet of prophecy took the view that the event of expectation was about to happen. Soon it would happen. It was imminent." All these terms can be seen as positive versions of the more negative notion of a delay. And then I add in brackets, "and as one might add in 2 Peter 3:9, the Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but is forbearing toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance." Quote, end of bracket. By interpreting various notes on imminence in the prophetic traditions as hints of deferment or delay, it is possible to see in them responses to or awareness of dissonance caused by the non-appearance of the expectation. The interpreters of the traditions were compelled to emphasize the nearness of the event in order to encourage the community to be faithful and to reaffirm their faith in the reliability of the expectation. Each text should be seen as the answer to the question foremost in the consciousness of the prophetic groups: when or how long? End of quote from Carroll. By their own accounts, the prophets had to deal with hecklers in their audiences. Jeremiah says, "Look," they say to me, "where is the thing Yahweh has promised? Let it come." Jeremiah 17:5. Ezekiel had to come up with a comeback to this taunt. "The days grow long and every vision comes to nothing." 12:22. His rejoinder, "Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, none of my words will be delayed any longer, but the word which I speak will be performed." 12:28. Jeremiah finds himself abashed by the failure of his prediction. "Ah, Lord Yahweh, surely you have completely deceived this people and Jerusalem, saying, 'It shall be well with you,' whereas the sword has reached their very life." Jeremiah 4:10. So, as Russell says, we do in fact see a consistent, long-enduring pattern throughout Old and New Testaments concerning prophecy, only it is not what he thinks it is. Instead of Jesus following in the footsteps of the prophets with their use of spectacular symbolism to describe historical developments, what we have is the New Testament writers continuing to do as their Old Testament predecessors did, banking on soon coming events as heralding the end of the universe in fire and meteor storms. They were wrong and they kept being wrong. And that is why today's fundamentalists, following the same trajectory, keep striking out too. Perhaps if they allowed themselves to understand that the biblical writers had so grossly and repeatedly erred, they would learn their lesson. But that they will not do for fear of forfeiting scriptural authority. And so the preterists,
Wow.
the
Okay.
preterists are they're screwing themselves here, and the reasoning is circular. Hey, the Old Testament predictions weren't literally fulfilled. The stars didn't fall out of the sky. Yeah, but they're doing the same thing. Oh, it was just metaphor. That's the ticket.
You got
And
a good
that, I
point.
think,
So,
that
so,
stakes the vampire.
okay, you said it well. I gotta break it down to dummies 101 for people like me, because I think I got what you're saying. These apocalyptic language scenarios were authentic, real. They thought this was it, and
Yes,
they
this was going
kept
to happen.
this was going to happen, and it never did the way that they thought. So they now have to reapply it by saying, "Oh, it was the Babylonian destruction. Oh, it was the Medes and the Persians. Oh, it was the Greco-Roman. Oh, it was
Well, actually, not quite, but almost. Apparently, the prophets did predict that there would be apocalyptic chaos when Babylon was defeated. I mean, the Babylonian Empire was like the fall of the Soviet Union,
right."
right? And they thought, how's this going to happen? We're not going to overthrow it. God will intervene from heaven with
Mhm.
lightning and comets and stuff like that. Well, what do you know? The Babylonian Empire did fall, but not that way. And so they later figured, well, I guess that was all just a way of stressing how cataclysmic it would be. And of course, you
Okay.
don't know that, but I think Carroll makes a pretty good case, because otherwise, what about all these other passages that say, hey, where's the victory you predicted? Oh, well, don't worry, it'll happen. But so I think, to me, that changes the whole thing.
That's interesting. So let's take a few examples, if you don't mind. A lot of these people who are trying to make sense of the text, who were like me, what they were doing is this: Jesus cannot be a false prophet, right? We're Christians. He cannot prophesy that something will happen and it does not happen. Therefore, it had to happen, but how did it happen
Yeah.
is the whole point. So we got to make sure it did happen. And some preterists are comfortable with being consistent and saying, look, the physical resurrection of all the saints and Jesus and the regathering, rapture, whatever you want to call it, they're all in heaven, literally, and it all happened, right? Literally. But it was in a microcosm, not in a world, literal, cosmic event. And when they get to places like 2 Peter that you quoted, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, which I love the critical. This is why I'm a big fan of criticism and the critical scholarship, unlike what I once was, where I hook, line, and sinker bought what the text said.
Yeah, me too.
When the text says he's not slack, somebody's saying he's slack, or maybe they're trying to defend God because God is being slack on his promise. So
that is what he says. The writer says, you ought to be glad that he's delayed it, because now you've got more of a chance to be saved. Sure, it's delayed, but it's not because he forgot what he was. Oh, look at my calendar. Rather, he said, I'm going to give him an extension on this. I don't want to see all those people damned. And it's like, how in Jesus says in Matthew 24, I think, if those days of the tribulation had not been cut short, no human being would have survived. Well, this is the same kind of thing, except it's extending it rather than shortening it. But it's the same idea. And then when 2 Peter says, for with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. People just make the writer look like an idiot when they say, oh, well, he really, when he said it was soon, he really meant by God, he's talking about glacial epochs and all that. No, the point is God's got all the time in the world. He's not under some schedule. Sure, it's been delayed, and you ought to be glad
and the
instead of
Christians
ridiculing.
are arguing each other, because the ones that are futurists, they call them futurists because they still believe in the future events. They go, a day is like 1,000. You guys are wrong. God's time is not your time. It can be, who knows how long it can be. It can be so many thousands of years from now. You don't even know. And the preterists are going, you guys are absurd. You're not understanding. And so there's this dispute. In 2 Peter, though, I wanted to bring up something I mentioned on the telephone with you before. They suggest the elements shall melt with fervent heat. And this is the temple. This is only temple-centric. Only the Jerusalem destruction is everything that you think of in the New Testament, in their mindset, is the temple. The whole apocalyptic language, which you talked about, the circular reasoning, the elements melting with fervent heat. Oh, that's all Torah. That's Judaism's old covenant system melting away. A new heaven and a new earth has come in. The new heaven and a new earth is a new people and a new covenant. Because they say, if you go to an Old Testament passage where Moses cries out to the children of Israel, it says, and he says, oh heavens, give ears, oh earth, or something. He's talking to the Israelites, calling them heavens and earth. So the new heavens and new earth, by that definition, is a new people. And there's this, it's not literal, as Christians have said, a literal new heaven, a literal new earth. They believe it all is more covenantal language. And like I said, how is the difference? They define things based on the context of when these should happen. So their eschatology influences the way their interpretive paradigm allows for certain things to be understood. And the church never understood them that way. They never understood the resurrection to be symbolic or possibly spiritual. It was a literal physical resurrection of the saints, supposedly, as the church has understood it, maybe both spiritual and physical. But what do you do with that stuff? What do you think about the 2 Peter temple melt with fervent heat element situation?
I don't think that does refer. Now, Margaret Barker's made very clear how the temple, like all ancient temples, was supposed to be a microcosm, a model of the universe as they depicted it. Eliade goes into that in his great book, The Sacred and the Profane, too. And so I can see how they might go that way. But I don't think 2 Peter is interested in that. It was probably written some 80 years after the destruction of the temple, and
Right.
not by Peter. But the thing about the heaven and the earth, there is, I think Charles Chauncey, in the colonial era, he was a universalist. Everyone is going to be saved. He's discussing this stuff, and he says that I forget exactly how it worked into his argument, but in Romans 8, I think, that God cursed the earth and so on, and he said, well, really, doesn't that mean the human race, the population of the earth, the whole shebang? I'm not sure it does, but it could. But in Mark uh, oh, one of the Great Commission versions in the Gospels, it says, "Go into all the world and preach to the whole creation." You're going to be like St. Francis saying, "Hey, squirrel, let me tell you about the gospel." No, or worse yet, "Hey, mountain, get a load of this." No, he says, obviously, it means the inhabited world. And yeah, it does. So again, they're picking up on some legitimate points, but in the context, it sounds more like, and critical scholars, whatever that's worth, say that this shows the influence of Stoicism, because they believed that the earth would be consumed in a great fire. I mean, burned up, hence the reference to the elements melting and all of that, and that this would happen over and over again. They believed in the eternal return and so on. And so that you can't be sure. And in fact, I don't think anything suggests that this means the temple. I mean, that's an ingenious idea, which I value, but it seems to me that's nothing in the context suggests that.
Have you heard the Christian statement? And I know the church fathers do this. They run to Josephus and they say, look, even Josephus validates Jesus's predictions. And they'll say, Josephus said he saw he saw the armies in the heavens, or he saw the sign in the sky, or something as signifying something in the Gospels or the New Testament. Therefore, it's a fulfillment. Have you heard that?
Well, yeah, our pal Joe Atwill says that, and even when I really disagreed with everything he said in that book, there was one thing I thought nowadays, of course, I take a more sympathetic view of it. But the one thing that jumped out at me originally when I was not friendly to the view is this thing Josephus says that you could see in the sky against the flames of the city being consumed, uh, armies clashing. And you have to think, does that have something to do with seeing the sign of the Son of Man, of human beings, in the sky? You know, that I can kind of see. But again, what came from what? It's did the Mark and Apocalypse is basically a kind of patchwork of Old Testament passages, and it's possible that one of the elements was the either Josephus himself in his account, or whoever told him about it, that some people thought that's what they were seeing, and that's reflected, and that is what Mark means. But it's really impossible to say that Jesus, in a vacuum here, just said this, and Josephus, not knowing about Jesus, recorded that it happened. I mean, that's possible, but it just seems to me it's a lot more wide open than
Unless
that.
they're both, and the only other explanation I can think of is they're both running off of a similar type of idea. And that's the only thing.
Yeah.
That's possible too. But you mentioned something important about the first coming of Jesus at one point when we talked about fulfillment.
Oh.
You said, look, the way the preterists are trying to make sense of this, like let me use the same logic to make a point on why the first coming of Jesus even needed to be. Why did he have to come? I mean, really, what's going on here, Dr. Bob?
Well, I remember, like, it dawned on me thinking about preterism, and now they figured, well, the second coming did happen, but we have only realized when and how it happened much later. He must have come back. He said he would in this generation, so it must have happened. There's no historical memory of that. There's no account of it happening. They're just figuring it must have happened. And I said, well, gee, isn't that kind of what one of the varieties of mythicism says? That they're all excited, especially in a period of crisis, about the coming deliverance of the Messiah. Oh boy, when's it going to be? We need him now. And that after the destruction of Jerusalem, they figured, is it possible that he did come back and we didn't know it? And that might be why the disaster happened. And because that was a common Jewish view that the Messiah would have come before now if we were worthy. And some of the rabbis said, if all of us kept one stinking Sabbath perfectly without a violation, that'd be enough. The Messiah would come. But apparently it ain't happening, and it's our fault. So the logic of preterism, to me, reinforces mythicism. It shows how, by the parallel, people could have done in the ancient world what these people have done in the modern one, and posited that the Messiah must have come. We just didn't know it. I remember decades ago, I was watching the old Mike Douglas show. Oh, I'm sure you never heard of it, but it was a talk show, and he had Seals and Crofts on there, and they did the number, and somehow their religion came up, and they said they were Baha'is, and that they said how ironic it is that everybody's waiting for the Messiah to come back when he already has, and they don't realize it. Of course, he's thinking of Baha'u'llah, who supposedly fulfilled all the Messianic prophecies. And that stuck with me for decades. And then, of course, the Gospel of Thomas says that, Lord, when's it all going to happen? The resurrection of the dead and so on. What you expect has happened. You just don't seem to recognize it. Good God, what on earth? And well, maybe they created it with that logic. How come he hasn't come? How could that be? The prophecies can't have failed. Maybe that means he did come.
I think
it's not like that's never happened, is what I'm saying, that people have drawn that conclusion.
You made very interesting points, and I find it so clever, not trying to rabbit trail here with Dennis McDonald. I'm going to be having him on the show, Dr. Dennis McDonald. I find it so clever how they took it into the Markian gospel of having the hidden Messiah concept of not revealing himself. They utilized Homeric epic ideas where Homer's secretly there and no one knows. And who are you, the Messiah? And shh, tell no one. It's like, why would you hide this secret? It's almost like they didn't want there to be a thumbprint in the real history there, according to the story, by borrowing from the Homeric epics theme and saying, here's our secret Messiah who is really here. You guys all missed it. Now you see these building blocks that are all crumbled over. Guess why? Back there, here's what's wrong. You guys missed him in this empty vacuum under Pontius Pilate, which is weird because I just did a show with Lena Einhorn, wonderful show. She parallels Josephus and shows the Gospels are shifted. They're not accurate. They're out of time.
That's amazing, yeah.
It is. So what is going on? And you brought that up, and it made me think, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. It doesn't deny there could have been a historical Jesus. It just makes perfect sense why they would fit him into a time.
Yeah.
What's going on? 40 years exactly prior to this war, too. It's kind of weird.
So ingenious. I remember picking up her first book about that in a bookstore in the Raleigh-Durham International Airport when I was on my way to some conference. I hadn't brought anything to read, and I went in there and I thought, oh, what is this? I think it was called The Jesus Mystery, the same title that Freak and Gandhi used. And I read it and I thought, man, oh man, this is amazing. I don't quite know what to do with it yet, but that's the case with Joe's theory and so forth. There's like the idea that Christianity came out of Buddhism. The arguments and the evidence for that is startling. And I point out in the introduction to Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, which John Loftus and I are editing, that if you're frustrated with historicist views of Jesus, oh, wait a minute, was he a eco-feminist, a Galilean Hasid, a revolutionary? You can make plausible cases for all of them, and you're sort of left like a donkey hovering between the two haystacks. Oh, which one should I eat? But don't think it's going to be any better if you are a mythicist, because there are loads of versions of mythicism, all of which are kind of probable, but plausible. But can you really have them all at the same time? I doubt it. This reminds me of something else. I think you should organize a book, Varieties of Preterism. As you said, there's so many of them. I knew about 3 or so. If there are a bunch of them, like the Quiverful movement, the Christian identity movement, these non-wacko theological opinions that you mentioned, that would be fascinating if there was some way to get advocates of them to explain why they think this. What a great book that would be.
In fact, that might just happen. I will
Ah,
definitely send this to them as well. There's groups with them. I have a part of a group. They made me an admin. It's got like 1,100, 1,200 people in it on Facebook.
oh,
Just this one group. It's called Preterist Perspectives. And it's from realized eschatology to idealist preterism to Israel only perspectives.
hmm,
And most of the preterists that we talk to are believers. They are theists and they are Bible believing theists. So technically, they buy the story and they want to be as consistent and say this is true. And they start with presuppositions. Jesus couldn't lie. You know, these there's certain things you couldn't do, can't accept. The IO preterists who've come out of the book as in like they don't believe it, still hold to the same methodology that, well, you know, Jesus predicted it. They use the retrospective idea that I was describing at the beginning in a lot of cases. And I may be over speaking because if there's any validity to these points, in my opinion, they were written after the fact and juxtaposed as if they are going to happen like they did with the temple's destruction. So let's see, the temple already fell. There were these, you know, messianic rebels that Josephus talks about that were predicting this. We'll just apply that to our Jesus, who predicted with a fine-tooth comb exactly what was going to happen. And we'll apply that as a prophecy fulfilled to Jesus, as if he actually fulfilled it. And by the way, also we'll apply these other prophecies like the Apocalypse, Armageddon, that war, which we thought would be worldwide because Christianity taught us that, is actually a war, Magog versus Gog. And the idea is that really what's happening is Rome, God's on the side of Rome, is against the high priest and scribes that Jesus is constantly rebuking. So the guys who are really in trouble are the Jews. And here's the real war. It's the Jews versus Rome. But in the Gospels, it doesn't make Rome look bad there. It makes Rome the tool, or as some of them would call it, the hammer of God. And God used Rome as a hammer. Jesus, you know, made sure he crushed the enemies, Satan, under his foot, fulfilling all these, you know. And
hmm.
so anyway, we can get a book written. I think it'll be
Oh, yeah, that would be fascinating.
absolutely. And I'd like to get you, if possible, to read it and give your critical review and response on it, because you are aware and understanding these concepts more than I think more than preterists even understand. They probably think you're a typical critical scholar, and and what is that, by the way? That's all subjective of what I mean by that. But I guess what they think that means is you only understand Christianity's dogmas and you only understand the mainstream views, and like you're a lot of them would suggest you're probably just like others, like Bart Ehrman and others, influenced so much by biased understandings from the church, you'll never grasp these concepts of preterism, and you would just mock and scoff these away. And they don't understand how open-minded you are to researching these things. Even if you do find them at the end of the day to be total bunk, you still will give them valid attention and dissect into the theories because you love reading this stuff and learning new
Hmm.
ideas.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
that's
that would be great. I'd like to write a response to all of them, and a respectful rejoinder. And I bet you could get Erdman's or Baker's or one of the mainstream evangelical publishers to deal with this, especially since they, being where they are in Michigan, there's a whole lot of Reformed Calvinists, etc., people there, and that I bet this would be. I bet they only know about these groups vaguely, or like the Duggars. That's who I was thinking of, the ones with the millions of kids.
yeah.
They. The people have heard of them, but there's no hint on the shows that I've seen as to why they do this. And my first guess was that there's some kind of Mormons, but don't want to look even weirder than they do. Well, not the case, but they are preterists, and which has everything to do with what they're doing. And the Christian identity loonies, you'd have to, that'd be sort of dealing with the devil. But if you could get somebody who say, we want your view to be known and discussed, we're not just going to denounce you or anything. I guess there's ways of finding out how to get a hold of some of these people. And what a fascinating book that would be.
Yeah, maybe you can help me with that and
I'd love to, yeah.
go on this endeavor together, because we're not here to critique their opinion. We want it to be, here's your space in the book. You have it, have at it. And at the end of the day, everyone can see the perspectives and go, you can have your opening book and say, look, or in the opening chapters, this is what this purpose of this book is. We want you to see how many views, variety of views of preteristic perspectives that we have in this book. And it's going to range from Black Hebrew Israelites who somehow claim that they are secretly lost Israelites and that the context of all of Scripture truly applies to only Israelites, but you had to be genetically tied into Abraham. And they also have European Israelite only type, the Christian identity. They believe that the Caucasian European tribes of Israel or somehow are connected to Abraham genetically allows them to have their entrance to the divine through Yahweh, etc., like because they're genetically connected. And they see this race idea throughout the biblical narrative of needing to be part of a particular race. It's a very, I guess you'd say, a racist God. Yahweh is pretty racist. It's Israel only. And they take that angle. And then you have your varieties of speculations and interpretive paradigms that are just wide-ranging ideas. But I love the whole idea of even bringing in mythicism, though I don't necessarily think that needs to be part of this book. Just, it's interesting to think why that is a valid case to be made in light of failed prophecy after failed prophecy, or better yet, let me put it another way instead of prophecy, failed promise after failed promise.
Yeah.
And they thought they were supposed to rule the world, if I'm not mistaken. And Israel, just like, if we look at the Muslims, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Bob, I'm just making the point of how I thought it was. I always thought this, and then there's some different ideas that have been trying to impose on this to tell me I'm wrong about this. But I always saw the same way that the Muslims and the Quran, Hadith, and the way that their law was supposed to rule supreme, and eventually they're supposed to rule the world. Right. Muslims' whole agenda at some point is to rule the world. I thought that Israel had the same promises from God that they would rule the world, and the other nations, the 12 tribes, would rule the world, and the other nations would be subservient in some way, whether you call it slavery, whether you call it just obedience or respect, whatever. At some point, they were going to rule the world the same way the Muslims thought the same thing. There are groups, though, in this IO group, for example, that think it's vacuumous. They think that Israel was going to rule Israel, and the blessings of Abraham were to the nations, which the nations are the 12 tribes. And it's all in a vacuum. And it's like there's no way to disprove, I guess, in a lot of ways. It's almost like they've pinned themselves into a corner in a way. And I'm open to the idea. I'm not closed off. I want them to know and see this interview. But it's like there's no disproving it. The same way of saying the rapture happened in 70 AD. How do you know? Well, no one told you. Well, that's an argument from silence. The text said it was supposed to happen, so it did. Okay, are the 12 tribes the only nations that are receiving the blessings according to Abraham? They would say probably yes, and some of them. And they use that interpretive presuppositional method throughout the whole entirety. And I tell them, look, you could be right in some places. I just don't think the whole book agrees with the whole book. These are different doctrines by different people. Even in the Old Testament, they don't all agree with each other. So sorry for the rabbit trail. I'd like to have you join me in the book and do this. So.
Oh yeah, we got a plan on it. Yeah.
Did this drain you yet, or what?
Did what?
Did this show drain you any, or was this a good show, or what? Well, what book was that you were reading out of that you wrote earlier?
It's called The Paperback Apocalypse from Prometheus Books. The subtitle is How the Christian Church Was Left Behind. And I was asked to write something critiquing the Left Behind series, Tim LaHaye and the other guy's name I forget. I take, let's see, the first 6 chapters explaining how Christian eschatology was put together from different sources, the evolution of apocalyptic, Messianic prophecy, the gospel of the Antichrist, the second coming, the secret rapture, the delay of the parousia. So I'm taking it bit by bit. And I have some stuff in there you really don't ever hear anybody say. And then I take the earlier and later Christian apocalypse novels like Salem Kerman, 666, and stuff like that, of which there are over 40 that I know of, and I examine every one of them. And it's including the Left Behind series. And as I say in the book, I have always, ever since I was a teenage fundamentalist, have loved these end times novels, and I still do. They're loads of fun and fascinating. So I don't just say, what a bunch of fools. I mean, I do have pretty severe judgments on some of the things they say about what the Bible apparently means. And then I have a chapter on the mainstream apocalypse novels and a couple of movies like The Omen and a bunch of these that really are not trying to promote any religious understanding or get you to repent. They just are interesting things. Or The Seventh Sign with Demi Moore and Jürgen Prochnow, a fascinating movie. And then I've got a long chapter on the Left Behind books, and then at the end of it, I have my own last chapter of the Left Behind series where I make a lot of fun of it, like what happens after the end, and it's pretty funny and points out errors and so on. Oh boy, I love doing subtitles and so on, and one of them I just noticed Theodicy and the Idiocy. It's great fun. And I really give it to LaHaye, I'm afraid, for his view, his interpretations of the Bible that get in there. Whereas, what the heck, what's the guy's name? Arthur. Oh, gosh.
This is a must-get book for any of you guys watching, for sure, especially
Jerry
in this field.
Jenkins. My thought is that Tim LaHaye came up with the bad Bible interpretations this is based on, and Jerry B. Jenkins actually wrote it. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure. And I say how enjoyable the books are and how Jenkins is a good novelist, but there's certain hilarious ironies and so on in it that only come. I think both of them are associated with Moody Press and are very conservative. But the one guy is a pretty good novelist, I think, and maybe I'm giving her too much of a break. But there's loads of these books and movies. It's unbelievable. It's like the Lost Gospel novels. Excuse me. Where there is like over 40 of them. And in another book called Secret Scrolls, I examine them one by one and say, how is biblical scholarship portrayed in this novel? What do they get right? What do they get wrong? What do virtually every one of them has the threat of how some big discovery of a lost gospel and or the corpse of Jesus, it blows the lid off or threatens to. And often it turns out it's a hoax and all that. And I say, well, now this is interesting. What do these writers think it would take to destroy Christianity, and would it? So there's a lot of interesting questions raised. It's pointless to say, oh, this is not a good one. This is. There's a lot to study about this if you want to understand popular religious belief.
I mean, you're right. It's like almost like anything you throw at it at this point, um, they'll evolve around whatever it may be, whether restricting the canon from what we're allowing to be God's word to, well, if
Well
God,
put.
yeah, there's so many. And when you exit the box, the freedom of exiting that box, and I'm not trying to bash Christianity. Look, I used to find hope in this thing. I mean, I used to love enjoying researching when I became an amillennialist, this light bulb went off. I went, oh my goodness. These allegorizing certain things. I never thought. I was so Tim LaHaye, like you say, literalist. I was a pre-mill dispensational fundamentalist. And millennialism, I graduated preschool and I was in elementary school. And then I found about Gary DeMar and Kenneth Gentry and other post-millennialist, partial preterist. Some of them are kind of theocracy they have, some of them are like, they go toward that Presbyterian, hardcore Puritanish type, stuff. And when I became a post-millennialist, partial preterist, I was in high school. Then I found out that Jesus came. I found out that he did come because he said he would, and not as a shadow, not as a type, as the real coming. He did come, and I had to wrestle with these words of Jesus, and I was using the canon, that we have typical Christians believe. And I came to this and realized there was a movement called full preterist. And they start to go into, listen, you just didn't understand. Here's what really is. Almost, it's like a Gnostic explanation, because when you get into the church and you talk about the, what's that technical theological term for Jesus being 100% divine and 100% man? There's a
the hypostatic union of natures.
Yes, the hypostatic. Well, you kind of have to, and some of these guys disregard the hypostatic union because they go, well, when he ascended on high, he cast off his flesh. There was no need for his body anymore. He is now spirit, whole, seated at the right hand of the Father. And then others say, that doesn't matter. Let's not get lost. So I got into all these nitpicky theological crannies that all this doctrine brings up and the disputes. And it meant endless stuff. Like books need to be written on this if anyone wants to really know. And the only way you're going to find out about some of these things I mentioned is to join some Facebook groups and get involved in discussing some of these ideas. If you're interested, write me. I'd be more than happy to. Definitely get Dr. Bob's books on these things. It always helps him too when you guys get the books. And I've noticed something, Dr. Bob. I don't know if you said the right prayer prior to the show, but the demons did not enter your screen.
Whoa, hey.
It's been a good show.
Oh, we've been healed. Hallelujah.
But I really appreciate this. This was, I guess, a long time coming. I needed to do a show with you on this particular idea. I've been trying to kind of come out, and I know that my audience probably goes, that view is irrelevant. It was relevant to me, and it was relevant in seeing the entirety of what this whole prophecy thing even entails. And you've brought some interesting ideas that I need to chew on, and one of those is, instead of saying how it was supposed to happen to try and defend Christ, and instead of just saying it's a failed prophecy, so to speak, we can go back and explain why Old Testament prophecies attempt to make this appearance of cosmic language. And it's not just, well, they only meant, that the Babylonians would be destroyed, not that the earth would split in half and, or like Revelation talks about a third of the land will, these crazy plagues and stuff. Did those plagues really happen?
Yeah. Well, of course, in every age, there are natural disasters and plagues and famines, which is one reason every generation has thought, oh, this is it. This is the last generation. And then you got to wonder if it's put in those vague terms purposely as a way of saying, well, this happens all the time. Maybe you jumped the gun, but it's still going to happen. There are all sorts of clues in the Gospels that this is a problem already. and they're this can't happen until the gospel is preached all over the world. Oh, well, that hasn't happened yet. Or one thing or another, they'll have or in Mark 13, this is going to happen and this is going to happen, but the end is not yet. I mean, it sounds to me like they're already trying to make excuses. Over the whole thing, you can put the phrase, yeah, that's the ticket.
Wow. I know that right when you said that the gospel hadn't been preached to the whole world, Paul says, the book of Acts say, what is this, that this gospel, these men who turned the world upside down with it? Okay, well, see right there, the gospel turned the world upside down. Or Paul says, this has been preached in all the world, or to every creature. I think First Colossians,
that's right.
Yeah. So it's like, the gospel has been, past tense, preached to every creature under heaven already. There's just so many nuances and things that take one book at a time, one chapter at a time, and I'm willing to look at critical scholarship instead of just trying to make sense of it. I'm using a scientific method. I'm trying to find holes. To be honest with you, I'm looking for what you've taught me to look for. These are not cleverly devised myths, as some would suppose. Really,
Yeah, boy.
When you could see
that shows, in my mind, that mythicism goes back at least as far as the 2nd century. That when Justin Martyr, in the dialogue with Trypho, has Trypho say, "You Christians have created a Christ for yourselves." That, to me, I mean, that doesn't sound like he's saying you've nominated your own candidate. It sounds to me like they're talking about mythicism, just stories they made up. Bard and others usually say, "Oh, they only mean you've got a failed candidate there that you won't give up." But I think they'd have said it differently if that's what they meant. And this thing in 2nd Peter, which is probably about the same age, in the 2nd century, there he says that people he says, "We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we told you about" what? "The power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." That sounds to me like the whole idea of Jesus coming to earth is alleged to be a myth by someone.
Wow. Yeah, this is good. This is good. And it makes me wonder, what coming? Is this the first coming? Is this the second? Eli Kittim, which is, his theory is totally different than anything I've ever heard. He wrote in your Journal of Higher Criticism. His ideas on Greek, he has a different type of way of approaching this, but he thinks Jesus never came to begin with. Now, he still believes. And it's like, what? Now, he's got a different way of viewing the Greek, but anyway, it makes me wonder when he says we did not, we're not lying about his coming. Is this the first coming, or is he saying, is this talking about the second coming? And I don't.
But it has to be past tense. He says, "For we were with him on the holy mountain when the voice of God spoke," and all that.
So this is the first coming of him saying the Messiah came, is what it appears to be.
Yeah, and that someone is saying, "You cooked this up, cleverly devised myths." And it might not mean that, but you can only go with what seems the natural reading of it. And boy, by the way, your the article that you and I collaborated on, I think it was Jesus, Joseph, and Osiris, or something like that, is coming out in the next issue of the Journal of Higher Criticism. And
Awesome.
I actually wrote the text, but it was just trying to flesh out this very intriguing theory you came up with about the relation of these characters, throwing even Joseph Smith and Josephus into it.
Yes.
It's really a fascinating bunch of ideas. And we just had an issue come out the last day or so, volume 15, number 1. This will be in volume 15, number 2, but it won't take that long, maybe a month or two. We don't have any schedule like we used to in the old days. We just put them out as we get enough stuff to fill them up.
Our friend Dave Allen is a contributor in that one.
Yes.
So
That's
worthy
right.
of reading because he has a messianic concept on what he thinks or a developing idea that he likes to espouse on the Jesus of history, according to his view. And I have not read it yet, so I'm looking forward to checking that out just to see what he says. Um, just fascinating. I hope this keeps growing. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get him a webcam. I don't want these demons coming. I don't think they're more than like 40, $50, Dr. Bob, for a good one, and we need to get you one, man. Tax season's in. People can start tithing, again. Tithe to the right cause. We're not priests in some back, church taking advantage of kids here. Okay. We need your help. Okay. We do the right thing here. I'm being facetious here.
Don't be like the Levitical tithe, which is like a handful of entrails. Like that we don't need.
Yeah, you can keep it. Don't worry. We don't want that. So, anything you'd like to say about prophecies? We close out with this show. I really enjoyed this.
Well, I am just a human pipsqueak. I cannot possibly know what is or is possible in the universe at large. There are couplets by Nostradamus that sound an awful lot like they're depicting Hitler and so forth. Who knows? I mean, there are I've had flashes of precognition. I don't know what's going on. Maybe someday brain science will explain it. It might be random, but I am truly open to any idea. I've always draw the line saying that you have to have evidence to think it is so, but you have to be careful to not to prematurely rule out something as absurd just because it seems strange, because a lot of stuff seems strange that we now accept.
Totally agree. And just in case you're wondering, the coronavirus is not prophesied. So do not get carried away thinking the doomsday is upon us. Thank you so much, Dr. Bob. I really do appreciate this. And thanks for everyone who helps make this show possible. We want to keep bringing this to you. I have future ideas, of course, a possible convention at some point in the future and having Dr. Bob there present in person. You've been a huge proponent on Myth Vision's growth and development and bringing insight. A variety of guests have, but you have been a predominant guest that we've had on here. And if any one of you watching knows how to get him onto Joe Rogan, is there a way to get him on a Joe Rogan podcast? Find a way to make that possible somehow, because Joe's only heard of the view mythicism from a brief political discussion over some neo-Nazi concept that was something to do with Mythicist Milwaukee that nothing bad. It was nothing bad, but there was like a mention briefly of a group called the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. And I can't remember the context, so I don't want to speak out of context, but it's nothing bad. Like they weren't supporting anything bad, but the lady on there mentioned them and he goes, Mythicist what? Oh yes, Mythicist Milwaukee. And this Mythicist movement is an actual idea that there was not an actual historical Jesus Christ. And that's the only thing that Joe Rogan has any knowledge of when it comes to mythicism that I'm aware of, other than when you mentioned one time one of the atheist proselytizers, what was his name, that mentions briefly that Jesus may not have existed historically to Joe Rogan?
Was it Richard Dawkins?
I think it was.
I don't believe he's committed to the view, but he seems to think it's worth considering.
Interesting. Which he'd be the wrong guy to really talk about the theory, just like you'd be the wrong guy to talk about, biological evolution and stuff, whereas he would be the guy to really do that talk. Yeah. So we need to get you on Joe Rogan podcast. This has been a great show. I love this. I'm going to return back to the show to hear what you say. And I hope I didn't hog any too much space on this.
No way. No.
This was wonderful. And if you guys have any questions, write them. Thanks a lot. And don't forget, we are Myth Vision.